Okay, I'll probably start now. Just before I start, if you want to ask questions, I'll take questions during the presentation, but if you don't want to shout your questions out or anything, if you go to that URL at the top, it's a little Google thing, it'll fire the questions over to my laptop and we can pick them up later, if you don't feel like shouting. You know, not everyone wants to. So I'm Kevin Jump. You may have heard of me. I do Umbraco stuff for a while. I've done a couple of things you might know. I did the style text box, which is a text box you can style. And I did the local gov starter kit, which is a starter kit for local gov. And I did usync, which is a thing that copies stuff between Umbracos and people use it. I also did a couple of other things. So these are the lesser known Kevin Jump packages. Publication queue, where you can send stuff to queue stuff to be published. Opening soon is an opening times thing, so you can say if things are open on a Monday. Simply forums is a great forums package, but don't put it on the internet. It's great for intranets. You put it on the internet, you'll get spammed. Client dependency health check is a little thing that allows you to reset the client dependency. And last week, if you're one of those people, you've got that site where they insist on taking it down for maintenance, there's a little dashboard for you. I'm sorry if you have a client like that, but now you've got a tool. But I'm not going to talk about that today. Today I'm going to talk about doing language translations just doing language stuff in Umbraco. I'm not really going to talk about the developer bit. I'm going to talk about the content-y bit. So I am going to quickly go through how you set up multilingual sites in Umbraco, but I'm not going to go into how you do dictionary items. I'm doing, when the editors type the words, how do you get them into other languages? So I'm just going to kick off with what Umbraco does. So what you get out of the box with Umbraco, how you can set up Umbraco for multilingual, and what you can do with that. So when you're setting up a multilingual site, you might know this if you've done multilingual, you have a couple of options. One of the options is you can do a many site setup, so that's where you have multiple sites inside your Umbraco and each one is a language. So I'm going to quickly demo that for you, hopefully. It's a bit blurry, but it doesn't really matter. Here you've got an Umbraco site with multiple languages, so there's two sites here. We've got an English version of the site and a Welsh. And the way it works is the Welsh site has a Welsh language here. That says CY, it's very blurry. And that's the domain name for the Welsh language site. So Umbraco knows if they go to that domain name, they get served up the Welsh version of your website. And so it does all the stuff, it puts the URL in, you click on it, and there's a nice Welsh version of your site. So that's just nice and simple. And that's how that works. You can, if you wanted to create a new language site there, all you really do is you copy your main site into the router content. It's important to do this relate thing because what that does is it gives a one-to-one relationship between the pages. So your About Us page on your home page is related to the About Us page in your Welsh page. And if you rename the Welsh one, it now knows that the two of them are related. So once you've done that, you just go in. And on this model, you just pick your language and then your domain. And that can be its full domain. So you can have like a de.yourdomain.com or you can have your domain.com/language or wherever you want. And Umbraco will work that out for you. And essentially, you do that. As long as you've got all your IIS settings and your DNS settings set up, which is obviously outside of Umbraco, then once you've got that and you've made it so you can actually tell it's a different site, then when you go through to that, you get a German version of your site. And that's basically how you set up a multi-language version of Umbraco with multiple sites. Really click. The great thing about that way, before I go on to the next one, is it's basically Umbraco out the box that. You haven't had to do anything clever. You've just done an Umbraco multi-site, it's worked out all the routing for you, as long as your languages are there. You might have to do clever things on working out how you send someone to a site, but when they hit the domain, they get that language. And then the other way to do it is the Vorto inception. And Matt's sitting there, he wrote Vorto. Vorto is essentially a way of doing all of that just from one single Umbraco site. So Vorto gives you a new data type, and in that new data type, it basically gives you tabs for each language. So your installed languages will go across the top within the single content node. And what you can then do is you can put other data types within Vorto. So in this example, it's a nested content item, which Matt wrote, inside Vorto, which Matt wrote. And then basically, you can go all the way in, and you can do single language site. The languages then are based on the current culture of the request, which moves you on to the next thing when you're doing Vorto. All requests are going to that single page. Basically, you have to work out what language is going to be based on the URL, or you might do it based on IP, but usually you do. If they come to this URL, this is our German site, so we need to pass that through in a German way. To do that, you sort of need to write a content finder and an Umbraco URL provider. So these are Umbraco classes you can extend to build when the content comes in on a certain URL, you can write code to say, oh, that's our German URL, you can find the node, and off you go. You don't have to do that yourself, though, because Jeron's done that in the one-to-one multilingual example, and if you want to know how to do that, look for the 24 Days article, and there's a sample site you can download, and actually most of the screenshots there are taken from that. And then the way that works is you have a URL segment slug, which is a Vorto, so you can pick the languages. And that then the URL provider is making the URLs for you. So very quickly, I can show you how that works. Essentially, this is the multilingual one-to-one demo site. If you downloaded it from GitHub, this is what you get. So where previously we had loads of sites on the domains, here you've got one site with all of the domains against a single site with the languages selected. And then within your content, this is the Vorto element with its multiple tabs. And each one of these is the language for that. So that's the Dutch version. That's the French version of the site. And then ultimately, that goes over to where the URL provider, I'll have a press the button, where the URLs are generated, again, based on this. So when this is in Dutch, that is helping that there. That's the URL provider. The URL provider writes them. I'm not going to go into this content. This is all the code you're going to see, and it's rapid. Basically, there's a content finder. It binds content. You want the technical detail, you should go look at it. But essentially, that's all it does. I'm not going to go into the line by line what it does, but it looks up node names and works out the content. And so a URL provider tells Umbraco what the URL is going to be, but when you click on it, it's a content finder. It takes the URL and finds it. And that's the site in French, but I've got the Chrome button turned on so it's in English. That's something you should turn off when you're testing new languages. Otherwise, you just end up with the site in English all the time. Oh, we've started again. We don't want to do that. Are we still stuck? Where's my mouse? OK. So that's how you can set your site up. There's a couple of other ways, but the general principle is they're the two ways. You'll either have a site with multiple sites in it, an Umbraco install with multiple sites, or one with one. And that's how you get to the different languages. But what I'm interested in this talk is how you get to the actual words and how you translate the text. So option number one for translating the text is just get people to edit the content directly. If you've got all the people in the organization who speak the language, can write it, know how to use Umbraco, and are there all the time, just get them to edit the pages directly. Really, you don't need the rest of this talk, because if you're fortunate enough to do that, you might as well use Umbraco. It makes no sense to hack about and send it off. But most people don't have that, and we need to send it somewhere to be translated. Essentially, we need someone who doesn't do Umbraco to do our translations for us. So staying with Umbraco, out the box, what you get? You might have heard of the translation section. It's off by default. You've probably turned it on. Or tried to do send to translate and been told you need to create a translator. That's usually what happens. But when you use the translation section in Umbraco to send to translation, this is roughly how it works. When it's set up, your editors can send to translate. Those are then sent to translators who open another dashboard. They export some XML. That's translated somehow. It comes back in the XML, and then it's applied back to your node to translate. So we'll just have a quick go at how you do that. So as an editor, you'd go to the bit of the site you might want to translate. So you might want the German bit translating. So you do send to translate here. You write a nice little please translate message to your editors. And then you send that off. And as far as the editor's concerned, that's gone now. It's gone to translation. What's actually happened in the background is it's created a task in Umbraco. And so the translator, which is a different user, would go in here. And they'd get a list of things assigned to them. And there you can see the Umbraco translation. And you might spot the first problem. So when you do this now, you download the XML file, which essentially you might send off to someone to translate. They'd hopefully open it in something that wasn't just Internet Explorer. And then they'd edit it. But you can see the problem with it is there's a load of JSON in there because that's the grid. And there's a couple of UIDs, because they're the links to documents and stuff. So I've spoken to a couple of translation companies, and where they've tried to do this, they've had a pain, because you've got to work out what the IDs are. So it takes forever, really, and it's fraught with danger. But if you do get one back, what you do is you click on this button, and they'll give you if you've got a translated one back and it works, then in Umbraco, you click upload, and your translation's complete. You can even preview it, but it's a bit of a lie, because it's actually already been applied. So it looks like that's what it's like. But I don't think it's been published, but it's already applied, so you'd have to use the order history to go back. So you go in and you publish. And essentially, that's how you would translate using the inbuilt Umbraco tools. And you end up with your content there, and it looks lovely. So the main thing with the translation section in Umbraco, and we're building up to something, is it's missing. It hasn't been really touched in about 4 or 5 years since Umbraco 7. And with the advent of things like the grid, all the internal controls now, a lot of them is JSON stuff, and it's just not built for that, so it's just doing loads of JSON things. It creates tasks all the time when you're doing those send to translate. It's sending new tasks. There's no real workflow in them, so if you create a load of tasks, send them off to someone to translate, and then create a load of new ones because you've updated the content before it comes back, it overwrites them, and you lose the changes. You don't actually see what's going on. I'm not 100% sure, I've played about with this for a bit, how you actually get new content translated with the Umbraco workflow. So if you've translated just German pages once, because the first time they're in German, and someone updates the English version of your site, that doesn't update anything in the German one, which is the one you send to translate. So I think you have to copy and paste the text from the English one into the German one, save it, but don't publish it because it's English. Then send it for translate, and then when it comes back, you'll have a German version of your site, assuming that the XML hasn't confused your translator. So is there an easier way to do that? I hear you scream. Yes. It's funny you should ask. There's Translation Manager, which is a thing what I wrote. So very, very quickly, I'm going to go into a lot more excruciating detail. With Translation Manager installed, your editors go to the page on the master site, click Send to Translate, select the languages they want to translate, choose whether they want it translating. They can choose how it's exported using a thing called a provider. Here we're exporting it in XLIF, which is a translating standard XML. They export it, it's gone. In the back end, the person who's managing your translations gets a job of that translation. They can go in, and in this one, we did a file. They can see the file. It's just nice text. There's no JSON. So that your translator will love that. They can load it into their software. You will download that and send it to them, or you can go on disk and just copy the folder and send them everything that's in it. They'll translate it for you, send you it back. When it's lovely and translated, you'll go, "Ooh, I've got my translated files," and you upload them. And this will read them back in, and then your translation will be done. You click. You can go in and see what your translator's done. You can see that they've put the word Welsh at the end of it, because that's how good they are. I use quality Welsh. If you don't like it, you can go in and edit it and say, "He doesn't know anything. I'm better at translating than he is." And ultimately, you can go, "Oh, I like it, though. I'm going to approve it and save it back to my website, or I'm going to approve it and publish it because it's perfect." And then back on your site, in your Welsh version of your site, you now have your About Us Welsh page with "Ooh la la Welsh," because they're great, and it's put everything back into the grid for you, and it's basically translated it all in one go. So now, the real quick one. Oh, it started itself. This is how it works, just so a quick one. You have the source content, and someone clicks Send to Translate. And what happens here is these value mappers, which are almost but not quite like property value converters, take the text out of all of the Umbraco bits and just give the text and create translation nodes, which are just things that say, here's the metadata for where this has come from, and this is the piece of text. You then say, "Oh, I need to create a translation job," and that goes to a translation provider. And they are either, like it could be a file-based thing, or it could be an API directly into a translation service. And then that goes off and the translation happens. The translation goes on, and either you upload the file back, or there's a periodic check that the files are there, or the APIs come back. And the translations are re-imported into Translation Manager, and you can view the nodes. If you're happy with them, they go back through the value mappers the other way, and it says, "Oh, this bit of text belongs in this value, in the grid, in a nested content item, inside of auto, inside a doc-type grid editor, which has got an archetype in it." And it finds it for you, which is the big pain of all of this. And then it goes back into content. So that's how it works as a basic flow. What I'll sort of do now is I'll just go into a bit more detail on how you set it up. So hopefully this will answer any questions about how it might work at a more technical level. So the first thing you do with Translation Manager is you create a translation set. A translation set basically says this is where our translations are coming from. So we have a master site. So you might say all our editors write it in English, and then we translate it to Welsh and French. And in there, you can just do a little bit of tweaking. So by default, Translation Manager will translate all the text-based elements out of a site. So if it's text, it's rich text, it's multi-string, all of them will be translated. But if it's a number or it's a media picker, then that's not going anywhere near your translations. There might be other things you want to exclude, so you might have product numbers. So the starter kit, as an example, has a product ID and an API key. You don't want them going to translate because they're just internal values. And then you can decide what happens when that content is created. So the other thing you can decide, the slight pain with the multi-site setup is that if you create a node on your master, it doesn't automatically get created in the other two, and they become out of sync. So there's a little box, if you tick it, when you create a node on your main site, it'll create that node in the other sites, keeping your sites in sync. And you can choose how your editors send jobs. So in that very quick demo before, you saw that the editor just sent the job right through. You might have a cost issue. You don't want your editors sending translations all day long and running up a massive bill. So you can stop them doing that and just say they can request the translation and someone else manages it. So very quickly, again, these are all nice and short, I hope, not too. If you create a translation set, you got this in the settings section. You can create multiple translation sets, but in reality, you probably only need one. But if you were translating forward and back, you might create more. So all we're really going to do is give our translation set a nice name. And we're going to pick and mask the site. And we also, this is a slightly different multi-node picker. It picks the language. Because if you've got a Vorto site, which this also supports, you actually have the master and the target is the same. So your master site might be your homepage in English and your target is your homepage in Welsh. And they go back in on themselves and it gets all inception-y. So here we just do the quick things, which is we want the node name translating. So obviously, if you translate the site and you translate the node name, the URLs will change and will also be Welsh. And here's where we go, oh, we don't want the product ID and we don't want the API key. And we don't want to include the person doc type because it's just a list of people's names. And that entire doc type we don't want translating. So if anyone ever sends it, it won't. And then down here, we can set defaults so that an editor doesn't have to pick where the translation goes. Because while you can give them that, in reality, you're probably just getting everything translated the same way. So you just say to your editors, that's how our translations work. So when that's set up, it's similar to the other demo, but this is what an editor can do. There's a couple of ways in which an editor can then send things to translate. So here we're just picking a section of the site, and we're just going to send that to translate now. And obviously we get all the languages we wanted before, but you notice this time we're not actually getting any options to send a job. That's because we haven't given the editors that option. They can include the child pages and they can decide whether there's any unpublished stuff. So if your editors have created a whole new section of the site, but it's not yet live, they can still send it for translation. You get the little extract bubbles, and that now sits as 3 extracted to be picked up by somebody and translated later on. Now, if you actually give them the permission, they can do a very similar thing. If it's just, these are just different ways of setting up send for the editors, really. If the set's been set up where they can create the translation node, then when they do this, they get this little button at the bottom saying, submit the translation job. So that does those 2 steps we saw in the diagram where it creates the nodes and submits the job. It does them in one go. So you don't need that intermediate, but they could potentially, run up a huge bill if they just sent everything to translate every day. Again, these are the formats. So there's 2 XLIF formats. There's XLIF 2, which is shiny and new, and there's XLIF 1.2, which is what everyone uses. So it depends on what platform you're using. If you're using client tools, 2 is what people use, but a lot of the providers seem to use 1.2. So that's the very basics of it. The last one is here, as I was talking before, there's an entire new section of the site being created, but we've chosen not to copy that into the other sites. So it sits on your main site, but it doesn't sit there. And what your editors get is a warning saying, we're going to create a whole new section of the site in the other languages now. And when you send that for translation, and again, we're going to send it through a translator, what happens is, as well as creating the translation nodes, we create the content nodes within Umbraco. So now if you look at the Welsh site when this is refreshed, it'll have that section ready to accept the translations. It's not being published, but there's a whole section now just waiting for when the translation comes back. That's where they'll go. So that's just the editor sending stuff, but the real question is where does all that go? And the answer is there's an entire dashboard now to manage translations. And this is where you can see where things are coming in, you can see the progress of jobs, you can understand where things are up to, and you can push all the stuff back into Umbraco. So the translation manager dashboard has basically 4 sections. It has pending, submitted, received, and archived, and they're the 4 stages that anything goes through when you send it for translation. Pending is full of things that your editors have asked to be translated, but haven't gone as jobs. So if you're controlling it, they sit in pending. And in here, as the person who's managing this, so there might be a webmaster. Let's call them that. It's a nice name. They can go in, they can view what's been requested. So on the left is what's being requested. On the right, if it was translated, is what's on that current language target site. And in here, you can go, oh, actually, we don't want that translating today for a reason. And you can just remove it, so it won't get sent through to a translation if there's a specific reason you don't want that thing translating. And then when you're happy as the webmaster, you can go in and select all of them, or even individual ones. And again, you get the choice to create them now and say, I want to send these as a job. So this is the provider model, which allows you to extend what you can send, and it all has its own little custom settings. And that goes, and when it's gone, you've got a submitted job now. And so submitted is the next stage of a job, and you can, as I said before, go directly to it. And within a submitted job, you can view when things were submitted, maybe if there's a deadline against them, exactly what the progress is. You can see what's going on. You can go in and go, this is what we've asked for translation. You can get the files. So if you need to send anything off to a translator, this is where you'd get them if you're using that method. If you're just using an API method, it would be sitting there saying, this has been sent to some translation company and they're dealing with it for you. Again, you do that, it goes through. Now that's received. So it's being go through your translation process and it's received. And then you're getting where this is going. There's a received dashboard. And within that, you can see what's happening with your content. So in the received dashboard, you have all of the jobs when they've come back. Now, some things might not, there we're doing file-based, so it's all manual, but there might be things where you fire it off to someone and it comes back automatically. And so those will go into received, and there are notifications. So what will happen is you can set up notifications and be emailed when things go into each of the stages. But again, if you don't like your translator, you can go in and edit them and say, they're really no good at this translating lot, and do it yourself. But I don't know why you would. And then you can pick them, and you can choose if there's a reason why something you've sent to translate isn't ready yet, or you want to do it again, or it's no longer relevant. Then you can just pick which ones you actually want to translate and just send them off, and they will get sent. Archive hides the job somewhere. Approve and save sends it to Umbraco but doesn't publish it. And approve and publish will publish the page. And it'll go off, and it sits in Umbraco now. And that's the basics of how the translation dashboard works if you're the person looking after that element. Go off and prove that it works, but we all assume I'm telling the truth, so let's just move on. So the thing that's been mentioned a few times there is the translation providers. I think this is potentially the bit that gives you the real power with this. The extracting stuff is a bit of like legwork that needs to be happening, but what translation providers do is they let someone else do all the work for you. So at the moment, there are what I would call 5.5 translation providers. So there are the Google Translate, Microsoft Translate, using Microsoft Cognitive API and all that, which will do direct translation. But let's be perfectly honest, it's no different than putting the Google Translate button on your website there. But you can send them through the machine APIs, and as they get better, that's an instantaneous thing. The STL one doesn't really work. The simple one's XLIF. Translator dashboard is, I'll show you in a sec, is actually an entire translation tool within Umbraco that comes as part of Translation Manager, that if you really want to, you can get your translators to use instead of another translation. They can do the translations direct in that, but not Umbraco. And the Translate Plus provider, a great way to find translation companies is to name your beta product after their company. And then they email you. And they say, you know, that's our name. And you go, oh, shit. but what I did is, this is why this is called Translation Manager now, not Translate Plus. But I've been working with them, and actually we've got a translation provider for that now. So if you use that one, what happens is it goes direct to their API. They have a dashboard where you manage your translations with them. And when you were happy with them at that side, they automatically come back in and get translated through this. And there were a couple of others I'm looking at, but to be perfectly honest, I think it's demand-based, because they're not hard to write, but I don't want to spend weeks writing 15 of these. There's so many of them. If people have translation companies they work with, then these are quite easy to write. All you have to do is just implement the translation provider, which just has like a check and a submit on it. And there's a couple of Angular views that do clever things if you want custom value. So when someone sends a translation to the simple file Translate Plus, there's an option for when they want the deadline and what notes they want sending with it. So now, I think finally, we'll skip something. The translator dashboard is for translators, so the people doing the actual translation. And it's more of an example of what you can do with a translation provider. Just as an aside, if you really wanted to, the power is you can implement the whole thing. So what this does is it gives you a section of Umbraco that is just for translation. So it's a bit like the translator manager, but except you just give it to your translators. And what you can see here is what's pending in each language. So these have been sent to translation for a translator to log into your Umbraco install. And they can go in and they can see the progress of each element and how many values there are that you're expecting them to translate. The difference here is you'd actually do this, which is you give yourself a single user who can only see one language and can only see the translation section, so they can't see any other bits of your Umbraco. So you've got some levels of security there. You're not saying go in and edit my main site. And they can just go into these elements and quite literally, again, they can see what they've done and what's to do, and they can click on any of those, go in, and then and just basically go through picking the text and saying, this is it. I like bowling ball in Welsh is bolbolio. That's my favourite one. And so they go through, they pick them. If, for whatever reason, and a valid reason, there's rich text elements inside your content, then when they edit those, they'll get a rich text editor so they can make sure that the bold's in the right place and all the lists are still valid. But essentially what they do is they translate in here, they confirm the translations. And because this is inside the Umbraco, the clever thing you can do with this is partial returns. So you can see 3 of these nodes have been done, but the other 18 haven't been done yet. And for some reason, you really needed them back quickly. You can get the translator can submit this as a partial return. And what a partial return does is it sends those 3 back to the main dashboard where you can then choose to implement them while the translator carries on working on everything else that you've got. And so that's just a way of, ideally you'd probably send individual translation jobs, but if the boss got onto you and said, oh, I desperately need that, you'd see then in here, they'd be able to go in and go, there's a partial return, and it's just got those elements that have been sent back. So you've still got everything in progress, but you've still got the 2 ones that are reviewing. And essentially the flow follows through from that. So the very, very last thing, honest, is continuous translation. So in all of them, you've seen the editor does send to translate. So they right-click and send when they're ready. You may not want to do it like that. What you may want to do is make sure that your sites are always up to date. So another option here is to do a continuous translation. And the way this works is that when a user, if this is turned on, it's not on by default. When an editor goes into a page and then they save it, so they go in and they make one change, they just change a title to something else. Then when they save that, what happens is a translation node is dynamically created for that single change. And so now, within the translation manager, for every language in pending, there is 1 item waiting. And that 1 item is just the one thing they've just changed. Now, obviously, you might not want to send a single line to be translated by somebody, because that's a bit weird. But what you can do is just leave that. And if your editor goes back a few days later and changes something else, then all that actually happens then is that that's put onto the same node, pending translation. And so it just builds up over time, and you just end up with still only got 1 item ready, and it's just that single item with the 2 things. And you can just build up over time, and then when you're ready, you can send that through to be translated, and it all comes back. And your editors haven't had to tell you that sections of the site are updated. They've basically just said, they're just editing, and somebody else, someone a bit more senior maybe, is just watching the translation manager dashboard and saying, oh, we'll probably want to keep this in sync now, it's getting out of date. So that's another way of working with it. So, in summary, it gives you loads of flexible configuration. It's got a reasonably simple interface, I hope. It allows you to manage the flow. So the other thing that I didn't go into in the demos is you can send the same things through 3 or 4 times and they'll stack up, and it'll tell you if you've got a translation in progress. If you try and send another one, you'll get a warning saying there's one in progress, what do you want to do? Because you've got 2 elements being translated at the same time. The provider model allows you to plug stuff in, so you can plug in external translation services or even into translation software. And there's an inbuilt view, so you never have to leave. And you can do continuous mode, which means you don't even have to tell your editors you're doing it. So if you want it, you can get it from NuGet, which is always the best way to get everything, or you can get it from R. Ooh. Okay. But, and there's a big but, and I'm really sorry, it's not completely free. Boo! It works fine if you're only doing 2 languages. So if you're a Welsh council, ooh, it works perfectly. But if you're doing anything else, and it's not going to. If you're working locally, it'll do 100 and odd languages without stopping, that's fine. But the minute you put it on a site, if you want to do more than 2 sites, you'll need a license. And a license works for all domains of that site. So if you've got de.example.com, it works on example.com. The moment it doesn't work if your website is completely different per language, but that's just not an intention to double charge people. That's just because it's quite hard to work out what one Umbraco site is. So if you do think about using it and your client has example.com in English and exampliao.com in Welsh or whatever it might be, then one license is fine, but I'll probably have to generate it for you. A license costs £500 per domain. That's just one install for all of the language. That one site will cost you £500. It is quite good, I think. And it will save you more than £500 worth of time. I would have loved to have done it free, but it took a long time to develop, and I couldn't justify it. So, questions. I do have a couple here. Look at that. I haven't got my mouse, though. This one I've been asked a few times. No, not yet. Is the short answer. I've thought about it, and I looked at it, and there's currently a pull request inside Umbraco to update the dictionary section because it's actually all old code, like the translation section was. So it's not easy to integrate into the right clicks within the dictionary section. So without writing an entire new view for the dictionary so you could send it, there currently isn't that. But there's a job in. There's a pull request in to update the dictionary. When it gets updated, a right-click send would be a nice and easy way to do that. Is there any questions out that aren't down here? And
so it will work with one-to-one sites as well. So if you're using Vorto. So if you're using Vorto.
Yes, with Vorto it does work. So Vorto's you have to be a bit careful with Vorto because obviously what will happen is you target the master site and the target sites are the same site but in different languages. But you have to tell it what properties to do because when they come back, it'll just try, if it's a text box, it would just put the Welsh one over the English one. So you say, I've got a Vorto, and it's called this, and it will find the languages in the Vorto. There's a value mapper for Vorto. So it does work, but you have to be a bit more careful with configuration, but that's just the way that works. It doesn't really handle the rich text internal links. That's one of the things it doesn't do. It's a bit of a pain because those internal links won't necessarily have relationship mapped within Umbraco, so finding them, it doesn't quite do that at the moment. There's another product that does internal links in rich text that does this really well, but I'd probably have to steal half the code from Usync to make that work. As the person who wrote it, that's quite hard in that way, but if you're using UIDs, it might be better. Yeah?
Coming back to that previous one, the internal links. You could use possibly something like Nextsuit that Dave Kustenberg's done, which keeps them track of all.
Yeah.
So maybe in somewhere there.
Well, the just going on to this is probably these things, the value mappers. So at the moment, the rich text one is actually the same as the bottom one, the simple text one. It just translates the text, it assumes there's text. I could write another value mapper there, plug-inable as well. So out of the box, value mappers are everything that comes with Umbraco. So text, rich text, multi-string, grid. Can't think, there's probably another one. Lists. No, not lists, because they're in these types. Vorto, archetype, doctype grid editor, nested content, not stacked content or the other thing. Because you only put them on like 2 days ago, so I haven't done them yet. They're probably the 2 big ones that aren't on it if people are using them a lot. But everything else is. And no, basically, if a value mapper exists, it maps those text values if it thinks it's there. Value mappers are relatively easy. They're just very similar to property editor converters. They take the source in and they return the translation items, which is the bits of text, and there might be multiple ones. So the grid with a nested content example is it goes all the way in, and when it gets to a nested content, it jumps into the value mappers that way.
If you're using the matrix editor?
You'd have to, if you've got a custom one that isn't one of them, you'd need a value mapper. So the value mapper is an interface that is basically two
And will
properties.
it then find that property
Yeah.
editor for editing
Yeah.
in the dashboard?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, no, you might have to write a custom thing for if it's a like funny editor. Ultimately, what it does is it reduces everything to its simplest constituent part. So it's a piece of text. So example, when it does the multi-listing, it's just 5 bits of text. It puts it back into a list. So the value mappers, you say what properties you're mapping, and then you take the source and you return a list of translation items. So you'd probably break down that into its constituent parts. Yes, which is what the grid and nested content and all of them are like, and that's why they were horrible to do. But ultimately, when they come out the other way.
One more.
Yeah, one more. Okay, I've got 2 more. Because this one's like quick. There are websites based on it. I haven't done multilingual for them, sorry. There's a Florida utility company, which I only found out the other day. It's working fine, but obviously after a hurricane, they were very random. I'm just going to say this now. It took 8 weeks solid work to write it, and then a couple of weeks to tweak it. And that's why it's not free. Sorry.
Cool.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Any more questions for Kevin? I think grab him after, but I think we'll all agree that packages like this are more than worth paying for, and particularly for the amount of time that Matt and Kevin and Lee Keller and the rest of the community put in. So there's always this trade-off between everybody wants it free because it's open source, but there's an awful lot of work, as Kevin said, 8 weeks of his own time gone into this. So, you know,